the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, Mr. President, Prime Minister, Majesties, Presidents, Governor Generals, Prime Ministers, and honored guests, Singaporeans who are in this hall, and Singaporeans who are watching this from all over Singapore, from overseas.
以及在海外看这个节目的新加坡人，我们今天下午聚集在这里。
The late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, who left us on 23rd March 2015. The Prime Minister will now deliver his eulogy.
President Tony Tan,
陈水扁总统、各位朋友、亲友、及同胞们，
this has been a dark week.
这个星期，新加坡举国哀悼，这些年来一直指引我国的明灯熄灭了。
We lost our founding father.
新加坡失去了建国总理李光耀先生，他终其一生为新加坡而活。
He and his team
他和伙伴们
led our pioneers
带领我们的建国一代，
this island.
创造了新加坡这个岛国。
Mr. Lee did not set out to be a
李先
politician.
生年少时并没有立志要当一名政治家，更别说当一名举足轻重的政治家。事实上，他的祖父原本希望他能成为一个英国绅士，但是一些重大事件却让他难以忘怀。
In colonial Singapore.
他经历过英国殖民地政府的统治，也在日治期间吃过苦头，面临危险和恐惧。这些生活的经历驱使他展开争取独立的斗争。
Many years ago in 1961, Mr. Lee said, "My colleagues and I are that generation of young men who went through the Second World War and the Japanese occupation and emerged determined that no one, neither the Japanese nor the British, had the right to push and kick us around." Mr. Lee championed independence for Singapore through merger with Malaya to form a new federation, the Federation of Malaysia. He worked tirelessly to bring this about and succeeded. Unfortunately, the merger did not last, and before long, we were expelled from Malaysia. Separation was his greatest moment of anguish, but it also proved to be the turning point in Singapore's fortunes. From the ashes of separation, he built a nation. The easiest thing to do would have been to appeal to Chinese voters alone. After all, Singapore had had to leave Malaysia because we were majority Chinese. Instead, Mr. Lee went for the nobler dream of a multiracial, multi-religious nation. Singapore would not be based on race, language, or religion, but on fundamental values: multiracialism, equality, meritocracy, integrity, and rule of law. Mr. Lee declared, "This is not a country that belongs to any single community. It belongs to all of us." He checked would-be racial chauvinists and assured the minorities that their place here was secure. He insisted on keeping our mother tongues, even as English became our common working language. He encouraged each group to maintain its culture, faith, and language while gradually enlarging the common space shared by all. Together with Mr. S. Rajaratnam, he enshrined these ideals in the National Pledge. He kept us safe in a dangerous and tumultuous world. With Dr. Goh Keng Swee, he built the SAF from just 2 infantry battalions and 1 little wooden ship into a well well-trained, well-equipped, well-respected fighting force. He introduced national service and personally persuaded parents to entrust their sons to the SAF. He succeeded. First, because he led by example. His two sons did NS, just like every Singaporean son. In fact, my brother and I signed up as regulars in the SAF. And we went in on SAF scholarships. Secondly, people trusted Mr. Lee, and they believed in the Singapore cause. And therefore today we sleep peacefully at night, confident that we are well protected. Mr. Lee gave us courage to face an uncertain future. He was a straight talker, and he never shied away from hard truths, either to himself or to Singaporeans. His ministers would sometimes urge him to soften the tone of his draft speeches. Even I would sometimes do that, to sound less unyielding to human frailties. And often he took in their amendments, but he would preserve his core message. As he said, I always try to be correct, not politically correct. He was a powerful speaker, moving, inspiring, persuasive in English and Malay, and by dint of a lifelong hard slog in Mandarin and even Hokkien. MediaCorp has been broadcasting his old speeches on TV this week, reminding us that his was the original Singapore roar, passionate, formidable, and indomitable. Above all, Lee Kuan Yew was a fighter. In crisis, when all seemed hopeless, he was ferocious, endlessly resourceful, firm in his resolve, and steadfast in advancing his cause. And thus he saw us through many battles. The battle for merger against the communists, which most people thought the non-communists would lose. The fight when we were in Malaysia against the communalists when his own life was in danger. Separation, which cast us out into a hazardous world. And then the withdrawal of the British military forces from Singapore, which threatened the livelihoods of 150,000 people. Because he never wavered, we didn't falter. Because he fought, we took courage and fought with it and prevailed. And thus Mr. Lee took Singapore and took us all from the third world to the first. In many countries, anti-colonial fighters and heroes would win independence and assume power, but then fail at nation building. Because the challenges of bringing a society together, growing an economy, patiently improving people's lives are very different from the challenges of fighting for independence, mobilizing crowds, getting people excited, overthrowing a regime. But Mr. Lee and his team succeeded at nation building. Just weeks after separation, Mr. Lee boldly declared that 10 years from now, this will be a metropolis. Never fear. And indeed, he made it happen. He instilled discipline and order, ensuring that in Singapore, every problem gets fixed. He educated our young. He transformed labor relations from strikes and confrontation to tripartism and cooperation. He campaigned to upgrade skills and to raise productivity, calling this effort a marathon with no finish line. He enabled his economic team, Bo Keng Swee, Hon Swee Sen, Lim Kim San, to design and carry out plans to attract investments, grow the economy, and create prosperity and jobs. As he said, I settled the political conditions so that tough policies could be executed. However, Mr. Lee was also clear that while the development of the economy is very important, equally important is the development of the nature of our society. So he built an inclusive society where everyone enjoyed the fruits of progress. Education became the foundation for good jobs and better lives. HDB new towns sprung up, one after another. Queenstown, Tua Payoh, Ang Mo Kio, to be followed by many more. We had roofs over our heads, and we became a nation of homeowners. With Mr. Devon Nair and the NTUC, he transformed the union movement into a positive force, cooperating with employers and with the government to improve the lot of workers. Mr. Lee cared for the people whom he served, the people of Singapore. When SARS struck in 2003, he worried about taxi drivers whose livelihoods were affected because tourists had dried up, and he pressed us hard for ways to find ways to help the taxi drivers. Mr. Lee also cared for the people who served him. One evening, just a few years ago, he rang me up. One of my mother's WSOs, women security officers, was having difficulty conceiving a child, and he wanted to help her. And he asked me whether I knew how to help her to adopt a child. So Mr. Lee was concerned for people not just in the abstract, but personally and individually. Internationally, Mr. Lee raised Singapore's standing in the world. He wasn't just a perceptive observer of world affairs, but a statesman who articulated Singapore's international interests and enlarged our strategic space. At crucial turning points, from the British withdrawal east of Suez to the Vietnam War to the rise of China, his views and counsel influenced thinking and decisions in many capitals. In the process, he built up a wide network of friends in and out of power. He knew every Chinese leader from Mao Zedong and every US president from Lyndon Johnson. He established close rapport with President Suharto of Indonesia, one of our most important relationships. Others he knew included Deng Xiaoping, Margaret Thatcher, Helmut Schmidt, George Shultz, as well as President Bill Clinton and Henry Kissinger, who we are honored to have here with us this afternoon. They all valued his candor and his insight. As Mrs. Thatcher said, Mr. Lee had a way of penetrating the fog of propaganda and expressing with unique clarity the issues of our time and the way to tackle them. He was never wrong. And hence, despite being small, Singapore's voice is heard, and we enjoy far more influence on the world stage than we have any reason to expect. Mr. Lee didn't blaze this path alone. He was the outstanding leader of an exceptional team. A team which included Goh Keng Swee, S. Rajaratnam, Osman Wok, Hon Sui Sen, Lim Kim Sang, Toh Chin Chai, Ong Pang Boon, Devon Nair, and quite a number more. They were his comrades, and he never forgot them. So it's very good that Mr. Ong Pang Boon is here today with us to speak about Mr. Lee later on. Thank you, Mr. Ong. Mr. Lee received many accolades and awards in his long life, but he wore them lightly. When he received the Freedom of the City of London in 1982, he said, "I feel like a conductor at a concert, bowing to applause, but unable to turn around and invite the accomplished musicians in his orchestra to rise and receive the ovation for the music they have played." For running a government is not unlike running an orchestra, and no Prime Minister ever achieves much without an able team of players. Because he worked with a strong team and not alone, because people knew that he cared for them and not for himself. And because he had faith that Singaporeans would work with him to achieve great things, Mr. Lee won the trust and confidence of Singaporeans. The pioneer generation who had lived through the crucial years had a deep bond with him. I once met a lady who owned a successful fried rice restaurant. She told me, "Tell Mr. Lee Kuan Yew I will always support him. I was born in 1948 and I'm 48 years old. The year was 1996. There was some issue then and this question had come up. I know what he has done for me and Singapore." She and her generation knew that, to use a Chinese phrase, 跟着李光耀走，不会死的. If you follow Lee Kuan Yew, you will survive.
Will never die.
Mr. Lee imbued Singapore with his personal traits. He built Singapore to be clean and corruption-free. His home was Spartan, his habits were frugal. He wore the same jackets for years and patched up the worn bits instead of buying new ones. He imparted these values to the government. And even when old and frail, on his 90th birthday, when he came to Parliament and MPs celebrated his birthday in Parliament, he reminded them that Singapore must remain clean and incorruptible, and that MPs and ministers had to set the example. He pursued his ideas with tremendous and infectious energy. He said of himself, "I put myself down as determined, consistent, persistent. I set out to do something, I keep on chasing it until it succeeds. That's all." Easy to say, very few do it. And this was how he seized opportunities, seeing and realizing possibilities that many others missed. So it was he who pushed to move Paya Lebar Airport to Changi. It was he who rejected the then conventional wisdom that MNCs were rapacious and exploitative, and he wooed foreign investments from MNCs personally to bring us advanced technology, to bring us overseas markets, to create for us good jobs. He wasn't afraid to change his mind when a policy was no longer relevant. When he saw that our birth rates were falling below replacement more than 30 years ago, he scrapped the stop at 2 policy and started encouraging couples to have more children. Having upheld a very conservative approach to supervising our financial sector for many years, he eventually decided the time had come to rethink and liberalize, but to do so in a controlled way. And this was how Singapore's financial centre took off in a new wave of growth to become what it is today. He was always clear what strategy to follow, but never so fixed to an old strategy as to be blind to the need to change course when the world changed. Nothing exemplifies this better than water security, which was a lifelong obsession of his. He entrenched the PUB's 2 water agreements with Johor in the separation agreement. He personally managed all aspects of our water talks with Malaysia. He launched water-saving campaigns. He built reservoirs. He turned most of the island into water catchment to collect the rain, to process, to use. He cleaned up the Singapore River and Kallang Basin. He dreamed of the Marina Barrage long before it became feasible and persevered for decades until finally technology caught up and it became feasible and it became a reality. And he lived to see it become a reality. When PUB invented new water and desalination became viable, he backed these new technologies enthusiastically. So the result today is Singapore has moved towards self-sufficiency in water, become a leader in water technologies, and turn a vulnerability into strength. So perhaps it's appropriate that today, for his state funeral, the heavens opened and cried for him. Singapore was another of his passions. On travels, when he came across trees or plants that might grow well here, he'd collect saplings and seeds and hand-carry them back home. He used these tanah grounds as a nursery and would personally check on the health of the trees, not just in general, but individual, particular trees. If they had names, he would know their names. He knew their names were the scientific names. Singapore's Prime Minister was also the chief gardener of the city in the garden. He had a relentless drive to improve and continued to learn well into old age. At 70, to write his memoirs, he started learning how to use his computer. Every so often he would call me for help, sometimes late at night, and I would give him a phone consultation and talk him through the steps, how to save a file, how to find a document which has vanished somewhere on his hard drive. And if he couldn't find me, he would consult my wife. He made a ceaseless effort to learn Mandarin over decades. He listened to tapes of his teacher talking, conversing with him every day, in the morning while shaving at home, in the evening while exercising at Sri Temasek. And he kept up his Mandarin classes all his life. Indeed, his last appointment on the 4th of February this year, before he was taken gravely ill early the next morning, was with his Mandarin tutor. He inspired all of us to give up our best. And he was constantly thinking about Singapore. At one National Day rally in 1988, he declared, "Even from my sick bed, even if you are going to lower me into the grave and I feel something is going wrong, I will get up." And he meant that. Indeed, even after he left the cabinet, occasionally he would still raise with me issues which he felt strongly about. During the budget debate 2 years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago, MPs hotly debated the cost of living, public transport, and so many other matters then preoccupying Singaporeans. Mr. Lee felt we had lost sight of the fundamentals that underpinned our survival. He emailed me. He sent me a draft speech. He told me he wanted to speak in the chamber to remind Singaporeans of these unchanging, hard truths, what our survival depended upon. But I persuaded him to leave the task to me and my ministers, and he took my advice. But his biggest worry was that younger Singaporeans would lose the instinct for what made Singapore tick. And this was why he continued writing books into his 90s. Bilingualism, hard truths, one man's view of the world, and at least one more guided by him, still in the process of being written, on the history of the PAP. Why did he do this? So that a new generation of Singaporeans could learn from his experience and understand what their security, prosperity, and future